it wasn't this particular model. This is a Mark 16 version, and it wasn't really developed until about 1945, but the ones that were involved in the Battle of Britain against the Luftwaffe were actually the Mark 4s and 5s. This aircraft, if you can look in the cockpit, the British liked a little wheel, not the stick. And on that wheel is a little brass button up there, and that is your trigger. It's called a thumb trigger. And so you would fire your guns by setting up the switches and then go ahead and use, here it goes again, all right. And by using the thumb to press down there and fire the weapons. If you also look behind the wheel, you'd see a little lever. Actually, it sticks out like this. A little lever that would fold in this way. And the guy could do it with his fingers pulling in that lever. And what that really is an electrically operated hand brake. In other words, it sends an electrical signal down to the brakes, which of course are hydraulically operated, and it tells it how much pressure through a series of, well, you guys know more about it than I would, of valves and a whole bunch of things like that, and tells it how much pressure to put on for the brakes. And that was designed because in 1934, there was a British wing commander by the name of Douglas Bader, and he crashed and he lost both legs. One was cut off above the knee and one below the knee. Well, the rules were different then, and they merely outfitted him with metal legs and said, go fly again. Well, he could push the rudder pedals, but they had not developed the technology to do this with your toes on the metal legs. So they had to develop a system that he could put on brakes, because on the top of the rudder pedals you push in, that's how you put on the brakes in an airplane. So anyway, that's what they did. They designed that system for him. Now, he was still flying it during the war. And in 1942, he was shot down over France. And when he bailed out, the opening shock of the parachute pulled both legs off of him. So he landed on the stumps. Well, the Germans picked him up, and they knew who he was, took him to the hospital, checked him out, he was okay, took him down to their club, sent him on a bar stool, gave him a couple of beers and all that stuff, and, you know, just general camaraderie, which there was a certain amount of, if you want to call it camaraderie, maybe that's not a good term, gentleman's respect between aviators in the early part of the war. The old German pilots and the older pilots that the Brits had and that we had. So they being the Germans, called on radio and notified the British that they would allow a Dakota, which is a Goonie bird, C-47, to come across the French coast at a designated point, a designated time, to deliver to a designated spot a new set of legs for Commander Bader. And they would have them in a box with, you know, and push them out with a parachute on. On the appointed day, here comes a Dakota across the French coast. About that he gets there, two of those VF-109s over there, the Messerschmitt 109s, German aircraft, popped up on each wing. They escorted him into the area and where he was going to drop it off, and he pushed out the box with the parachute. They flew on back up there, and as they came back across the coast, both German pilots gave him a salute. They peeled off, went back to their base, and the C-47 or the Dakota went on back to England. So Bader got his new legs, he put them on, next day he tried to escape. He didn't make it. They caught him, and he spent the rest of the war as a guest of the German. Now we're going to go over to his adversary right here, which is the 109. Incidentally, is that flyable? Yeah. Okay, there you go. Will we ever fly it again? Probably not. Once again, like aircraft like these, they're not that many they're not available really. And if you crash them, what have you got? You got a very expensive pile of junk, is what it boils down to. Okay, this is the commonly called ME-109. It is truly a BF-109, and developed by Willy Messerschmitt for the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. This was the pride of the Luftwaffe. There were about 35,000 of these built during World War II. This is the Dash 10G model, or Gustav, and this was the prime one of the 109s. About 24,000 of that 35,000 were this particular model. This was not an easy airplane to fly, particularly for a young, inexperienced pilot. Several reasons. Look at the landing gear. how close together they are. Well, if your landing gear are close together, and also these are splayed outward a little bit, but if they're close together and you touch down at a relatively high speed, it's at that point that it's the hardest to control that aircraft. And the closer together the gear is, the harder it is to control. The wider apart it is, obviously the easier it is to control. So that we call this in the flying game is a ground loop waiting to happen, basically. Another factor of this was the fact of the visibility out of the cockpit right there. The front visibility was very limited. This is a very tight cockpit, a very small cockpit. So I'm convinced that the Germans took all their big guys and made them bomber pilots and all their little guys and made them fighter pilots. Because I sat in it and I'm not that large, and it's tight fit. Armament, through the spinner, you got a 30mm cannon. Up on the top of the bonnet up there, you see 2 indentations there, and those were 2 12.7mm or effectively 50 caliber machine guns that would fire through the prop. Anybody question? Everybody knows why they didn't shoot off their prop?
Because the guns were timed to make sure that they never hit the prop.
I can't hear you.
The bullets were timed to make sure they never hit the prop.
Very good answer. A timing gear, basically. It was commonly called an interrupter gear that would not allow the gun to shoot through the propeller. They did in World War I, until they developed this, they did shoot off a few propellers. But then they said, hey, we can't afford that because the airplane doesn't fly too well without the prop on it. So what they did was go ahead and some smart guy, German in fact, developed the interrupter gear. Another factor of this airplane is the very short legs it has. That means a very short range with full internal fuel, about 360 miles roughly. So picture I'm taking off from France to escort the German bombers over London. By the time they got there and the Brits came up in the Spits and the Hawks, then these guys only had about 5 or 10 minutes to play. Then they had to go back and refuel. So they put a drop tank on there, an auxiliary fuel tank of roughly 60 imperial gallons. And the object is you take off, you use that fuel first. And then if the Brits come up and intercept you, you drop it. It's drop tank. Look at the one over there. You can see it proves what happens. They do drop. Got a little smashed in nose right there. So that would give them roughly maybe 60, 80 extra miles, roughly our time. You can convert that to time. Of the aircraft that were lost, excuse me, pardon me. Of the aircraft that were all lost there during the war, half of those were lost due to accidents, not combat, of this type machine right here. Because they were, like I said, very difficult. If you'll come around this side and look at the engine, that is the original Daimler-Benz engine. Some of the later versions had a Spanish engine in, but this is the Daimler-Benz. As you can see, it is supercharged. It is an inverted V12, and it is inverted, and you can tell by the lower stacks right there, because it is a V, because you've got a cannon running down the center right there. So it kind of straddles over the cannon. So that means that you can't have a direct drive from your engine to the propeller. So you had to have an offset. And what this is merely, to make it simple, is merely a gearing arrangement, a series of worm gears, I guess you'd call it, that go up and they turn the propeller true. Because you can't afford to have a propeller not turning true. If it wobbles, you're going to lose it. The Germans are also, along with the British, were the developers of the leading edge slat right here. Now, very simply, this is air load only, an aerodynamic slat. There are no hydraulics, no electrical. It's controlled strictly by the load of the air. So when it's sitting on the ground, it's like this. On takeoff, as the air load increases, that pushes up and it becomes streamlined. As you come in for a landing then, and you want to slow down, as you're slowing down, this will come out. And this is an oversimplification, I know. But effectively what it does, it effectively will increase the area of your wing, which would increase your lift, and probably more important, it diverts an airflow which goes across your aileron or your elevators back there, giving more positive control, which which means that you can come in at a higher angle of attack and slower and land. Now they also figured in a dogfight, you got some guy on your tail up there, okay? If you could honk this baby in, pull it in tight enough, then theoretically, notice that word, both the slats would come down, which would allow you then to pull it a little tighter, and then maybe you could get on his tail. The biggest drawback was if only one of them came out and the other one didn't come out, you're probably going to go into one horrendous snap roll, and you're probably going to lose control of it, and you're probably going to come down in a horrendous spin, and about that time you probably ought to know some prayers, I think. Anybody sprechen Sie Deutsch? Huh? Yeah, what does that say?
Pick up before flight, probably.
Remove before flight?
You're right. It says the same thing worldwide, only in different languages. It says remove before flight. And why do you remove this before flight?
Pitot tube.
The pitot tube. And what does the pitot tube do?
Applies pressure.
Tells you how fast you're going, how high you're going, and other things, right? So if you don't remove it before flight and you take off, you don't know how high you are and you don't know how fast you are, so you could be in a world of hurt. I want to point out that this particular aircraft is painted in the colors of Eric Hartmann, who was a top leading ace of the German Air Force. 354 kills, if I remember correctly, most of which were on the Russian front. But I believe he had out those, I don't know, what was it, Jim? Probably 60 of them might have been on the Western front, I think, of the total kills, somewhere around there. But painted in his colors. Now, a lot of people say, well, he had over like 2,000 sorties, I think, during the war. And, you know, our deal was, in the bomber guys, 25 sorties and you're home, 25 missions. And they said, well, why didn't he go home? Well, he was home because he was defending the fatherland, so they didn't have any place to go. They were there for the duration. He did survive the war, and we, being the Americans, gave him to the Russians after the war, and he spent, that was part of the agreement, I guess, that they had, and he spent about 10 years in one of the gulags there, and then got out in about 55 and came back to Germany, and he died about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, something like that. Great pilot, just one of those guys that was a natural all the way. You notice the little heart under the cockpit right there? It says Usch, U-S-C-H. That was his wife. Her name was Ursula, and that was a nickname for Ursula, or so I thought. I had a German couple in here one day several years ago when we were over the other building, and I mentioned that that's a nickname for Ursula, and the guy shook his head. He said, no, it's not. He said, my wife is named Ursula. He says, you got to add an I after that. It has to be Ushi. He says, you call them Ushi when you love them, and you call them Ush when you don't like them anymore. So that could be true. I don't know. Okay, why don't we head on over here? And this is the guy now, the 51 over there, the Mustang, which was probably one of the major reasons that towards the end of the war we salvaged daylight strategic bombing.
Check this out. I can actually make a title for the current film. Yeah.
This aircraft is a North American P-51D Mustang, and this actually was developed at the request of the British. The 51 was first, but it had an Allison engine in it, and it didn't have very good performance. Then the British put in the famous Merlin, and this thing was then really up to speed. I will point out this also has a buddy seat behind the cockpit, and I got a ride this summer. And that, for an old jet pilot, that was fantastic. And we were up about 1,000 feet, going cruising along about, maybe 280, 290 miles an hour, about just around the area, right there for about 15 minutes. But what a thrill, awful noisy. And the bad thing was I didn't have a stick picker. I was a captive audience there. Okay, 650 caliber machine guns. They mounted a drop tank on this baby, and this was one of the first fighters that was truly capable of escorting the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. And so when the little friends, as the bomber pilots call them, When the Germans would come up there with their fighters, the little friends, of course, would immediately jump into them. Saved an awful lot of bombers, I guarantee you. Because before, the bombers had to depend upon their own armament. This is flyable, obviously. As you see, this one's a good airplane. It doesn't need a very big letterbox. This great big old engine right here is a 9. It's called a JT9 there. This is the engine. It is on the 747, the Boeing 747. This develops 46,100 pounds of thrust. Now let's compare that to that little engine right on the other side of it, which is a Goblin engine, which is in that aircraft you see over there, which is a little jet. I think it's still there, isn't it? Yeah, there it is. The Vampire, which was the first operational jet fighter of the Royal Air Force in 1946. That develops 3,300 pounds of thrust. Now, the aircraft I flew the most was the F-86 Saberjet and the F-100 Super Sabre. And the 86F model that I flew had